To understand the medieval era, one must first strip away the romantic veneer of stained glass and chivalric romance to confront the visceral, organic reality of an age defined by the fragility of the human body and the crushing weight of labor. As we look back through the corridors of history, we often gaze upon the spires of cathedrals or the battlements of castles. Yet we rarely look down at the mud, the muck, and the bodily fluids upon which this civilization floated. In my years of studying the theological implications of suffering and the sociological structures of the past, it has become evident that the hierarchy of heaven, the great chain of being, was mirrored by a hierarchy of earth, where one's proximity to filth determined one's social worth. Tonight, let us descend from the pulpit and walk among the forgotten. The invisible laborers whose daily existence was a testament to the endurance of the human spirit amidst conditions that the modern mind can scarcely comprehend. We begin our examination not with the sword, but with the shovel in the shadowed corners of the medieval city where the Gong farmer plied his trade. In a world before modern sanitation, the biological reality of a crowded city was an overwhelming sensory assault, and the management of human waste was not merely a logistical problem, but a moral necessity. The Gong farmer, often working under the cover of darkness to spare the sensibilities of the waking world, was the cleaner of the cesspits, the emptiness of the privies, a man whose professional domain was the gong, the waste of his neighbors. There is a profound theological irony here, for while the priest cleansed the soul, the Gong farmer cleansed the city, preventing the physical corruption that would otherwise consume the population in disease and miasma. These men, and occasionally women, would descend into the deep stone-lined pits, sometimes submerged to their waists in the accumulated excrement of months or years, breathing in air thick with methane and decay. It was dangerous work, not merely offensive. The fumes alone could suffocate a man, and the structural integrity of a rotting cesspit was never guaranteed. Yet they were paid well, a testament to the fact that society values what it desperately needs but refuses to touch. They were the nightmen, shunned in the daylight, banished to the margins of social interaction, yet possessing a strange, grim camaraderie. They removed the waste to the lay stalls at the city limits, returning the organic matter to the earth as fertilizer, completing a cycle of life and death that was far more visible to the medieval mind than it is to ours. If the Gong farmer represented the management of waste, the Leech collector represented the desperation of medieval medicine. We must remember that the medieval understanding of the body was governed by the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health was a matter of balance, and the most common method to restore this balance was phlebotomy, or bloodletting. To facilitate this, the medical profession required the hirudo medicinalis, the medicinal leech, in industrial quantities. This demand created a class of laborers, often the poorest of the poor, frequently women, who would wade bare-legged into the stagnant, cold marshes and fens where these creatures thrived. They were human bait. There is a haunting image here of the collector standing perfectly still in the dark water, waiting for the parasitic kiss, allowing her own blood to be the lure. It was a slow, chilling form of martyrdom for the sake of a few coins. They risked infection, trench foot, and the endless dampness that seeps into the bones, all to gather the tools that barber surgeons would use to treat everything from headaches to melancholy. It was a job of passive endurance, of suffering so that others might ostensibly heal, capturing the very essence of the feudal transaction, where the bodies of the many sustained the comfort of the few. Yet the suffering of the leech collector pales in comparison to the psychological abyss faced by the plague barrier. When the Yersinia pestis, the great mortality, swept across Europe, it dismantled the social contract. In normal times, death was a ritualized event, surrounded by the sacraments, the gathering of kin, and the solemnity of the churchyard. The plague shattered this. The sheer volume of death necessitated a new grim profession. Men who would enter the houses marked with the Red Cross, retrieve the bloated and blackened corpses, and transport them to the hastily dug mass graves. These men were pariahs, walking reminders of the inevitability of death. They worked without protective gear, perhaps clutching a rag soaked in vinegar or holding a posy of herbs in a futile attempt to ward off the bad air, or miasma, which was believed to carry the disease. They were often accused of spreading the contagion they sought to contain. Viewed with a mixture of necessity and revulsion, to be a plague barrier was to live in the constant shadow of one's own imminent demise, burying entire families, stacking bodies like cordwood in the consecrated earth that could barely contain them. It was a job that stripped death of its dignity and the worker of his humanity, reducing the sacred vessel of the body to mere biological refuse. This proximity to death and decay was not the only form of hazardous labor. The production of textiles, the very clothes upon the backs of the nobility, required a process known as fulling. The fuller was the worker who cleansed and thickened wool, a necessary step to transform woven threads into usable, weather-resistant fabric. But the chemical agent required for this cleansing was stale urine, rich in ammonia. Thus, the fuller spent his days marching in place, knee-deep in vats of fermenting human urine and fuller's earth, trampling the cloth to break down the oils and tighten the weave. It was a rhythmic, exhausting dance in a vat of filth. The fumes were blinding, the ammonia burned the skin, and the legs of the fuller were often marked by sores and infections. They were walkers, treading the grapes of wrath, not for wine, but for wool. They were banished to the edges of towns due to the stench of their trade, yet without them, the vibrant tapestries and warm cloaks of the era would not exist. It forces us to consider the hidden cost of luxury. The velvet and wool that draped the shoulders of kings were prepared by the blistered feet of men wading in waste. And if the fuller worked the earth, the treadmill operator worked the engine of the sky. In the construction of the great cathedrals, those stone prayers rising toward the heavens, physics demanded a power source to lift the massive ashlars and timber beams. This power was human. The treadwheel crane was a colossal wooden hamster wheel, and inside it, a man would walk endlessly, climbing a staircase that never ended, using his body weight to turn the winch that hoisted tons of rock hundreds of feet into the air. It was a job of vertigo and monotony. A slip could mean a crushed limb or a fatal fall from the scaffolding. The operator was a biological motor, reduced to a beast of burden, walking miles without moving an inch, his sweat literally building the house of God. There is a profound theological tension in this image. The soaring beauty of the Gothic arch, designed to lift the soul to the divine, was raised by the groaning, repetitive, dangerous labor of a man trapped in a wooden cage, walking in circles until his shift ended or his body failed. These professions, the handlers of dung, the collectors of parasites, the buriers of the dead, the stompers of urine, and the walkers of the wheel, form the foundation of the medieval economy. They reveal a world where the human body was the primary machine, expendable and resilient, capable of enduring immense degradation to maintain the fragile order of civilization. If the previous professions were defined by their interaction with the waste and weight of the physical world, there existed other roles that navigated the darker intersections of biology, hierarchy, and survival, roles that required a peculiar form of psychological callousness. Consider, for instance, the relentless war against the vermin that besieged the medieval city. The rat-catcher was not merely an exterminator. He was the frontline infantry in a losing battle against a biological tide. In the medieval imagination, the rat was more than a nuisance. It was a thief of grain in a time of scarcity and a vessel of pestilence, though the bacteriological connection to the flea was yet unknown. The rat-catcher, often a figure of folklore and suspicion, navigated the crawl spaces, the sewers, and the granaries, armed with nothing more than a ferret, a terrier, or a club. He was a man who lived in the liminal spaces where civilization met the wild, uncontrollable infestation of nature. He was paid by the tail, a grim peace rate that turned the destruction of life into a tally of survival. He smelled of the beasts he hunted, covered in bites and scratches, risking rat-bite fever and the very plague he was inadvertently fighting. There's a deep irony in his existence. He was an essential component of public health, yet he was treated as a pariah, a man who voluntarily associated with the unclean. He was the shadow that moved through the cellars, fighting a war that could never truly be won, for the medieval city, with its open drains and waste, was a paradise for the rodent. From the filth of the cellar, we ascend to the gilded cage of the royal court to examine a role that perverted the very concept of justice, the whipping boy. This position is a theological curiosity, born from the doctrine of the divine right of kings. If a prince is chosen by God, his person is sacred. To strike the future king is to strike God's anointed. Yet, a child must be disciplined. The solution was a grotesque parody of vicarious atonement. The whipping boy, often a high-born companion to the prince, was educated alongside him, ate with him, and played with him, forging a bond of intimacy. But when the prince erred, it was the whipping boy who was flogged. The theory was that the prince, witnessing the suffering of his friend caused by his own sin, would be moved to repentance through guilt rather than physical pain. It was a psychological weaponization of empathy, placing a burden of moral responsibility on a child that was staggering in its cruelty. The whipping boy was a living scapegoat, absorbing the physical consequences of another's transgression, a role that illuminates the twisted logic of absolute power where even the distribution of pain is hierarchical. While the court dealt in psychological scars, the lime burner dealt in physical disintegration. In the production of quicklime, essential for mortar, plaster, and agriculture, men worked in environments that mimicked the fires of purgatory. The lime kiln was a beast that had to be fed continuously, burning limestone at blistering temperatures. The lime burner stood at the mouth of this inferno, breathing in dust that was chemically caustic. When this dust mixed with the sweat on his skin or the moisture in his lungs, it underwent a chemical reaction, becoming slaked lime and releasing heat. In essence, the lime burner was slowly being dissolved by the very product he created. His lungs turned to stone, his eyes burned, and he lived in a perpetual cloud of white, choking powder. He was the alchemist of construction, transforming rock into the glue that held civilization together, but the cost was his own breath, his own flesh. The danger was not just chronic, but acute. A fall into the kiln meant instant incineration, a disappearance so complete that not even a bone would remain. Alongside these laborers of the day, there moved the laborers of the night, those who harvested the dead, not for burial, but for science. The resurrectionist, or grave robber, occupied a morally complex position in the late medieval and early modern transition. As medical schools began to seek a deeper understanding of the human anatomy, the Church's prohibition on dissection and the scarcity of legally available cadavers created a black market for the dead. The resurrectionist was the supplier. He was a thief of rest, entering the graveyard under the moon to hoist the freshly buried from their slumber. It was a job of speed and silence, motivated by the coin of anatomists who asked no questions. While society condemned him as a ghoul, history might view him as a reluctant partner in the advancement of medicine. He desecrated the sanctuary of the grave so that the sanctuary of the living body might be better understood. A grim utilitarianism that valued the knowledge of the flesh over the sanctity of the ritual. Yet, not all intimacy with the body was illicit. Some was codified into the highest honors of the land. We must speak of the groom of the stool. To the modern mind, the idea of a nobleman whose primary duty was to assist the monarch in the act of defecation is laughable, but in the context of the medieval court, access was power. The king's body was the center of the political universe. Therefore, the man who attended the king in his most private moments possessed an unparalleled opportunity for influence. The groom of the stool was the keeper of the royal secrets, the confidant who stood by the monarch when guards and ministers were banished. He wiped the royal person, inspected the royal excrement for signs of illness, a vital medical duty, and in doing so became one of the most feared and respected men in the kingdom. It illustrates the alien nature of medieval hierarchy. Dignity was not defined by the nature of the task, but by the status of the person served. To handle the waste of a peasant was degradation. To handle the waste of a king was a privilege. Finally, let us turn our gaze to the medieval kitchen, a place of heat, noise, and frantic preservation. The medieval cook was not the artist of the modern restaurant. He was a desperate manager of decay. In a world without refrigeration, the preservation of meat was a battle against time and bacteria. The cook wielded fire and spice as weapons. He worked in a great hall filled with smoke, turning spits of meat that were often on the verge of turning foul, masking the scent of spoilage with saffron, cloves, and pepper. It was a dangerous environment. The heat was intense, the fires open and roaring, and the risk of food poisoning was a constant specter hanging over the banquet. The cook held the lives of the household in his hands, balancing the humors of the diners with the ingredients in the pot. He built subtleties, elaborate sculptures of sugar and paste, while standing knee-deep in grease and offal. His labor was the alchemy of survival, turning the suspicious and the preserved into the edible and the grand, ensuring that the feast, the central social ritual of the medieval world, could proceed without killing the guests. These roles, from the rat-infested cellar to the king's privy, reveal a civilization where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the clean and the unclean, were constantly negotiated by the labor of the invisible many. If the previous professions were defined by their interaction with the waste and weight of the physical world, there existed other roles that navigated the darker intersections of biology, hierarchy, and survival, roles that required a peculiar form of psychological callousness. Consider, for instance, the relentless war against the vermin that besieged the medieval city. The rat-catcher was not merely an exterminator. He was the frontline infantry in a losing battle against a biological tide. In the medieval imagination, the rat was more than a nuisance. It was a thief of grain in a time of scarcity and a vessel of pestilence, though the bacteriological connection to the flea was yet unknown. The rat-catcher, often a figure of folklore and suspicion, navigated the crawl spaces, the sewers, and the granaries, armed with nothing more than a ferret, a terrier, or a club. He was a man who lived in the liminal spaces where civilization met the wild, uncontrollable infestation of nature. He was paid by the tail, a grim piece rate that turned the destruction of life into a tally of survival. He smelled of the beasts he hunted, covered in bites and scratches, risking rat bite fever and the very plague he was inadvertently fighting. There is a deep irony in his existence. He was an essential component of public health, yet he was treated as a pariah, a man who voluntarily associated with the unclean. He was the shadow that moved through the cellars, fighting a war that could never truly be won, for the medieval city, with its open drains and waste, was a paradise for the rodent. From the filth of the cellar, we ascend to the gilded cage of the royal court to examine a role that perverted the very concept of justice. The whipping boy. This position is a theological curiosity, born from the doctrine of the divine right of kings. If a prince is chosen by God, his person is sacred. To strike the future king is to strike God's anointed. Yet a child must be disciplined. The solution was a grotesque parody of vicarious atonement. The whipping boy, often a high-born companion to the prince, was educated alongside him, ate with him, and played with him, forging a bond of intimacy. But when the prince erred, it was the whipping boy who was flogged. The theory was that the prince, witnessing the suffering of his friend caused by his own sin, would be moved to repentance through guilt rather than physical pain. It was a psychological weaponization of empathy, placing a burden of moral responsibility on a child that was staggering in its cruelty. The whipping boy was a living scapegoat, absorbing the physical consequences of another's transgression, a role that illuminates the twisted logic of absolute power, where even the distribution of pain is hierarchical. While the court dealt in psychological scars, the lime burner dealt in physical disintegration. In the production of quicklime, essential for mortar, plaster, and agriculture, men worked in environments that mimicked the fires of purgatory. The lime kiln was a beast that had to be fed continuously, burning limestone at blistering temperatures. The lime burner stood at the mouth of this inferno, breathing in dust that was chemically caustic. When this dust mixed with the sweat on his skin or the moisture in his lungs, it underwent a chemical reaction, becoming slaked lime and releasing heat. In essence, the lime burner was slowly being dissolved by the very product he created. His lungs turned to stone, his eyes burned, and he lived in a perpetual cloud of white, choking powder. He was the alchemist of construction, transforming rock into the glue that held civilization together, but the cost was his own breath, his own flesh. The danger was not just chronic but acute. A fall into the kiln meant instant incineration, a disappearance so complete that not even a bone would remain. Alongside these laborers of the day, there moved the laborers of the night, those who harvested the dead not for burial, but for science. The resurrectionist, or grave robber, occupied a morally complex position in the late medieval and early modern transition. As medical schools began to seek a deeper understanding of the human anatomy, the Church's prohibition on dissection and the scarcity of legally available cadavers created a black market for the dead. The resurrectionist was the supplier. He was a thief of rest, entering the graveyard under the moon to hoist the freshly buried from their slumber. It was a job of speed and silence, motivated by the coin of anatomists who asked no questions. While society condemned him as a ghoul, history might view him as a reluctant partner in the advancement of medicine. He desecrated the sanctuary of the grave so that the sanctuary of the living body might be better understood, a grim utilitarianism that valued the knowledge of the flesh over the sanctity of the ritual. Yet, not all intimacy with the body was illicit. Some was codified into the highest honors of the land. We must speak of the groom of the stool. To the modern mind, the idea of a nobleman whose primary duty was to assist the monarch in the act of defecation is laughable. But in the context of the medieval court, access was power. The king's body was the center of the political universe. Therefore, the man who attended the king in his most private moments possessed an unparalleled opportunity for influence. The groom of the stool was the keeper of the royal secrets, the confidant who stood by the monarch when guards and ministers were banished. He wiped the royal person, inspected the royal excrement for signs of illness, a vital medical duty, and in doing so became one of the most feared and respected men in the kingdom. It illustrates the alien nature of medieval hierarchy. Dignity was not defined by the nature of the task, but by the status of the person served. To handle the waste of a peasant was degradation. To handle the waste of a king was a privilege. Finally, let us turn our gaze to the medieval kitchen, a place of heat, noise, and frantic preservation. The medieval cook was not the artist of the modern restaurant. He was a desperate manager of decay. In a world without refrigeration, the preservation of meat was a battle against time and bacteria. The cook wielded fire and spice as weapons. He worked in a great hall filled with smoke, turning spits of meat that were often on the verge of turning foul, masking the scent of spoilage with saffron, cloves, and pepper. It was a dangerous environment. The heat was intense, the fires open and roaring, and the risk of food poisoning was a constant spectre hanging over the banquet. The cook held the lives of the household in his hands, balancing the humors of the diners with the ingredients in the pot. He built subtleties, elaborate sculptures of sugar and paste, while standing knee-deep in grease and offal. His labor was the alchemy of survival, turning the suspicious and the preserved into the edible and the grand, ensuring that the feast, the central social ritual of the medieval world, could proceed without killing the guests. These roles, from the rat-infested cellar to the king's privy, reveal a civilization where the boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the clean and the unclean, were constantly negotiated by the labor of the invisible many. Beyond the confines of the city walls and the domestic spheres of the court, we encounter the laborers who engaged in a primordial struggle with the elements themselves, shaping the very bones of the medieval landscape. Consider the quarryman, a figure defined by his antagonistic relationship with the earth. If the architect provided the dream of the cathedral, the quarryman paid the price in sweat and blood to wrest the material from the ground. His existence was a daily battle against the stubbornness of geology. Armed with primitive iron wedges and sledgehammers, he sought the fault lines in granite and limestone, exploiting the weaknesses in the rock to harvest the blocks that would eventually house the sacraments. It was a profession of brute force and subtle physics. He might pour water into heated fissures, waiting for the thermal shock to crack the stone, a dangerous game of thermodynamics played without safety goggles or respiratory protection. The air he breathed was thick with silica dust, a slow-acting poison that coated his lungs and shortened his life. A condition we now know as silicosis, but which was then simply the stone cough. He lived in a world of constant kinetic potential, a hanging slab, a slipping chain, a sudden cave-in. Every cathedral that stands today, soaring in its Gothic lightness, rests upon the broken bodies of these men who turned the mountains into geometry. They were the forgotten sculptors of Christendom, their names unrecorded in the stone they died to harvest. While the quarryman worked in the slow, heavy time of stone, the wartime messenger lived in the frantic, adrenaline-fueled immediacy of the present. In an era before encrypted signals or radio waves, the command and control of entire armies rested on the stamina of a single human being. The messenger was the nervous system of the medieval state, a solitary figure tasked with traversing the fog of war. He was a runner, a rider, a living vessel of information who had to navigate enemy lines, bandit-infested forests, and the chaotic topography of the battlefield. His burden was not heavy in weight, a scroll, a sealed letter, but it carried the weight of history. Orders to attack, pleas for reinforcement, or the capitulation of a king. He was vulnerable, often unarmed to increase speed, and if captured, he faced interrogation or execution as a spy. He existed in a state of perpetual flight, praying that his horse would not stumble, that the weather would not dissolve the ink of his message, and that the banner on the horizon belonged to a friend. To be a messenger was to be the most hunted man on the field, the fragile thread holding the strategy of kings together against the entropy of chaos. Anchoring the technological capacity of this society was the blacksmith, the master of the four elements: earth, the ore; fire, the forge; air, the bellows; and water, the quench. The smithy was the industrial heart of the village and the castle alike. This was not merely a craft, it was a sensory assault. The blacksmith lived in a world of perpetual twilight and heat, the rhythm of his life dictated by the ringing of the hammer on the anvil. He was the maker of the plowshare that fed the peasant and the sword that killed him. His body was shaped by his trade, defined by deafness from the clamor, burns from the sparks, and a muscular asymmetry born of swinging the hammer. He was essential, the engineer of his day, yet he was bound to the fire. A figure of awe and utility who forged the tools of civilization while breathing in the soot of his own creation. And then there was the voice that gave all this suffering meaning. The bard. We must be careful not to romanticize this figure as merely a wandering musician. The bard was the custodian of cultural memory and the medieval equivalent of the public relations machine. He traveled from hall to hall, trading verses for bread, his existence precarious and dependent on the whims of his patrons. He was a historian for hire, a man who would sing of a lord's bravery, even if the lord had hidden in a ditch, or of a lady's beauty, even if she was plain. Truth was secondary to the rhyme and the reward, yet he held a terrifying power. A satirical song could ruin a reputation faster than a lost battle. He was the internet of the Middle Ages, spreading news, gossip, and propaganda through the oral tradition. He was the weaver of the narrative, ensuring that despite the mud, the blood, and the plague, the era would be remembered as an age of heroes. But in the year 845, a new narrative arrived, one that no bard in the Frankish kingdom had the words to suppress. It came from the north, silently at first, then with a roar that shattered the complacency of the Carolingian world. The river Seine, usually the artery of commerce and peace for the city of Paris, became a highway for the apocalypse. It began with the sighting of sails, square, striped, and ominous, and the low draft of the long ships that allowed them to penetrate deep inland. This was the arrival of Ragnar Lothbrok. To the Franks, this name was not just that of a man, it was a conjuring of dread. Ragnar was a new kind of warlord, a Viking chieftain who combined the brutality of the berserker with the cold calculation of a general. He did not come with a raiding party, he came with an armada. 120 ships, 5,000 warriors. The scale of this invasion was a psychological shock to a kingdom already fracturing under its own weight. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, found himself the heir to Charlemagne's crown, but not his strength. His kingdom was torn by civil war, his nobles were divided, and his defenses were porous. Ragnar, sensing this weakness like a wolf senses a limp, did not merely attack. He performed a masterclass in terror. As the fleet rode up the Seine, the rhythm of the oars beating like a slow drum of doom, they systematically dismantled the Frankish psyche. Villages were burned, monasteries, the spiritual anchors of the community, were looted, and the population was put to the sword or the shackle. Ragnar understood that the weapon was not just the axe, but the fear of the axe. He wanted the rumors to reach Paris before his ships did. He wanted the city to be defeated by its own panic before he even laid eyes on its walls. When the Norsemen finally reached the Ile de la Cité, the heart of Paris, the contrast was stark. The Vikings were professionals, hardened by the sea and unified by greed and the cult of the warrior. The defenders of Paris were a patchwork militia, led by a king whose authority was crumbling. The siege that followed was not a heroic stand. It was a dissection. Ragnar's men controlled the river, cutting off supplies, while on land they demonstrated their cruelty with theatrical flair. In a horrific display of psychological warfare, Ragnar ordered the execution of Frankish prisoners in full view of the city walls, hanging them effectively as ornaments of terror. He was dismantling the Franks' faith in their king and their god simultaneously. Inside the walls, hunger and plague began to do the Vikings' work for them. The prayers of the clergy went unanswered, or so it seemed, as the smoke of burning abbeys drifted over the starving city. The realization settled upon Charles the Bold that he could not win with steel. His army had been routed, his strategy outmaneuvered. He was left with the only option that remained for a king who wished to save his capital but lose his honor. He opened the treasury. Here is part 4 of the narrative reconstruction. Part 4. The Silver Wound and the Geometry of Salvation. The resolution of the siege of Paris in 845 was not written in blood, but in ledger books. It was the moment when the sword bowed to the scale, and the heroism of resistance collapsed into the pragmatism of survival. King Charles the Bald, staring down the annihilation of his capital, chose the path of the Danegeld, gold for the Danes. It was a humiliating calculus. 7,000 livres of silver, a staggering 2.5 tons of precious metal, stripped from the churches, the nobility, and the peasantry alike. When the heavy chests were carted down to the riverbanks, under the watchful, predatory eyes of Ragnar's warriors, the silence was deafening. This was not a treaty between equals. It was an extortion racket played out on a geopolitical stage. Ragnar sat there, perhaps weighing a coin in his hand, a smirk playing on his lips, witnessing the mighty Frankish Empire purchasing its own existence. The Vikings did not leave because they were beaten. They left because they were bored and rich. As they loaded the silver onto their longships, straining the timber hulls with the weight of their plunder, they took with them something far more valuable than the metal, the knowledge that the Franks could be bought. Ragnar sailed down the Seine not merely as a conqueror, but as the architect of a new economic reality where fear was the currency and kings were the customers. The aftermath for Paris was a trauma that festered long after the dragon ships vanished over the horizon. The city had survived, yes, but its soul was scarified. The smoke cleared to reveal a populace hollowed out by fear and resentment. The blame circular began immediately. The church whispered that the king was weak and God was punishing his lack of piety. The nobles grumbled that the king was a coward who drained their coffers to save his own skin, and the common people, who had starved in the cellars while the negotiations took place, realized they were on their own. The legacy of 845 was the birth of a pervasive anxiety. The Danegeld became a precedent, a signal fire to every Viking chieftain in the north that the coast of Francia was essentially a bank vault with a broken lock. The raids that followed in the subsequent decades were relentless, transforming the political geography of Europe and eventually leading to the cession of Normandy. Ragnar Lothbrok had proven that one did not need to occupy a kingdom to rule it. One simply had to hold a knife to its throat and wait for the payout. From this landscape of external terror and political failure, the medieval mind turned inward, seeking a fortress that could not be sacked by Northmen, the fortress of the soul. In a world where life was nasty, brutish and short, where plague could strike without warning and Vikings could appear on the river at dawn, the promise of the afterlife became the only stability worth pursuing. Thus we enter the age of the pilgrimage, a phenomenon that was at once a spiritual journey, a penance, and a desperate attempt to hack the economy of salvation. To be a Christian in the Middle Ages was to be acutely aware of one's own filthiness in the eyes of God. Sin was a physical weight, a debt that had to be paid, and the pilgrimage was the currency of repayment. It was the way of St. James, the Via Francigena, the road to Canterbury. It was the belief that movement itself could be holy, that by dragging the body through the mud, the spirit could be scrubbed clean. The motivation for this arduous undertaking was a complex tapestry of guilt and hope. The Church, in its wisdom and its need for control, had codified the system of indulgences. If you had committed a grave sin, adultery, murder, heresy, the priest might assign a pilgrimage as penance. It was a way to work off the purgatorial sentence while still on earth. But it was not always punitive. For many, it was an act of thanksgiving for a child born or a sickness survived. For others, it was simply the only socially acceptable excuse to leave the crushing monotony of the village, to see the world beyond the turnip field, to be a tourist in the guise of a penitent. The wanderlust was as real then as it is now, but it had to be cloaked in the heavy wool of devotion. The preparation for a pilgrimage was a ritual in itself, a shedding of the secular identity. The pilgrim would stand before his parish priest to receive a blessing, donning the uniform of the holy traveler. He took up the staff, a sturdy pole that served as a walking stick, a weapon against wild dogs, and a symbol of the third leg of faith. He put on the spera, the scrip or satchel, small and leather-bound. designed to carry only the barest essentials, for poverty was a virtue on the road. On his head he wore the wide-brimmed hat to ward off the sun and rain, and upon it he pinned the badge of his destination, most famously the scallop shell of Santiago de Compostela. This shell was more than a souvenir. It was a passport, a signal to the world that this person was under the protection of the Church. It granted him the right to pass through lands without tax, to sleep in the hay of monasteries, and to beg for bread without shame. He carried with him a letter of pilgrimage, a document that proved his bona fides, ensuring he was not merely a vagrant fleeing a master or a debt. Thus equipped, he stepped out of his door and onto the road, leaving behind his family, his trade, and his safety, walking into the vast, ungoverned spaces of medieval Europe with nothing but his feet and his faith. Once the threshold of the home was crossed and the village steeple disappeared behind the tree line, the pilgrim entered a liminal space where the social protections of the feudal world dissolved. The road was not a neutral conveyance. It was a hostile entity, a theological testing ground where the landscape itself seemed to conspire against the traveler. To walk 1,000 miles in medieval Europe was to submit oneself to the anarchy of geography. The roads, often little more than mud tracks haunted by the ghosts of Roman engineering, turned into quagmires with the slightest rain, threatening to suck the shoes from one's feet. Nature was not the romantic backdrop of later poets, it was a predator. Wolves prowled the fringes of the forests, viewing the solitary penitent not as a soul in need of salvation, but as biomass in need of consumption. Yet the beasts of the field were often less dangerous than the beasts of the soul. The highway was plagued by wolf's heads, outlaws and bandits who saw the pilgrim not as a sacrosanct figure, but as a soft target, a mobile donation box with legs. A scallop shell might grant access to a monastery, but it offered no protection against a cudgel in the dark. Thus, the road taught the first lesson of the journey. Trust is a luxury, and solitude is fatal. This danger necessitated the formation of the Pilgrim Band, a transient community that serves as a fascinating microcosm of medieval society. Forced together by the survival instinct, knights walked with peasants, merchants with monks, and fishmongers with widows. It was a suspension of the rigid class hierarchy, a fellowship of the dust where the only rank that mattered was the ability to keep walking. These groups were chaotic polyglot assemblages, mirroring the narrative diversity of Chaucer's tales. They were rife with friction. Arguments over the pace of travel, the sharing of food, or the snoring of a companion in a cramped barn were daily occurrences. Language barriers turned simple directions into pantomime farces, and the clash of regional temperaments, the stoic Saxon rubbing shoulders with the volatile Lombard, added a layer of social stress to the physical exhaustion. Yet, within this crucible of shared suffering, a profound solidarity emerged. They nursed each other through dysentery, defended each other against thieves, and buried those who fell by the wayside in shallow, roadside graves. It was a bond forged in the mud, a realization that stripped of their titles and land, they were all merely fragile creatures seeking the same divine mercy. However, the road was also a corridor of temptation. The pilgrimage route was lined with the infrastructure of vice that preyed upon the weary. Taverns, brothels, and gambling dens clustered around the major waypoints, offering a different kind of solace than the church. It was a supreme irony that a journey undertaken for the purification of the soul was often financed by the gambling away of one's inheritance or interrupted by a night of debauchery in a roadside inn. The pilgrim was constantly caught between the sacred destination and the profane journey, navigating a landscape where a holy relic salesman might sit at the same table as a cut-purse. This was the pilgrim trap, the economy that sprang up to harvest the faithful. Villages would miraculously discover a saint's bone or report a vision just as the pilgrim season began, diverting the flow of travelers and their coins into local coffers. It was the commercialization of grace, where faith was the commodity and the pilgrim was the consumer. When the spires of the destination finally pierced the horizon, be it the great cathedral of Santiago de Compostela, the tomb of Becket in Canterbury, or the Holy Sepulchre itself, the emotion was overwhelmed by the spectacle. The medieval shrine was the Disneyland of the soul, a sensory explosion of incense, gold, and chanting, designed to awe the peasant who had known only the mud of his farm. But at the heart of this splendor lay the relic, the physical fragment of the holy. We must look at this with the eyes of the time. The bone of a saint was not a memento. It was a battery of divine power, a conduit for miracles. Pilgrims would collapse in weeping exhaustion before these reliquaries, begging for the healing of a withered limb or the forgiveness of a mortal sin. Yet the intellect cannot help but notice the relic inflation of the era. There were enough splinters of the true cross to build a fleet of ships, and enough skulls of John the Baptist to imply the saint had 3 heads. The Church often turned a blind eye to the provenance of these items, for they drove the economy of salvation. The pilgrim bought badges, candles, and vials of holy water, often indistinguishable from ditch water, trading his silver for a tangible piece of the divine to carry home. The return journey was the final, often overlooked, chapter of the pilgrimage. The man who walked back through his village gate was rarely the same man who left. Physically, he was broken, scarred by the sun, hobbled by tendinitis, perhaps carrying a chronic cough from sleeping in damp hay. Financially, he was often ruined, having spent his livelihood on the road. But spiritually, the result was ambiguous. Some returned bitter, their prayers unanswered, the silence of the saint ringing in their ears, realizing that the miracle they sought was not on sale. They were the disillusioned, for whom the pilgrimage revealed the cynicism of the Church's machinery. But for others, the transformation was real. It was not found in the magic of a bone, but in the resilience of their own feet. They had seen the vastness of the world, tasted the bread of strange lands, and survived. They carried the bragging rights of the survivor, the scallop shell on their hat serving as a veteran's medal. They had walked to the edge of the world and returned. In doing so, they inadvertently stitched Europe together, their footsteps creating the trade routes, the exchange of ideas, and the shared cultural consciousness that would eventually lead the continent out of the dark. The pilgrimage was, in the end, less about the destination than the crushing, illuminating reality of the journey itself. Here is part 6 of the narrative reconstruction. Part 6. The Liturgy of Steel and the Theatre of the Ego. If the pilgrimage was the theatre of the soul, designed to strip the individual of vanity through the democracy of the dust, the tournament was the theatre of the ego, a grand, thunderous celebration of hierarchy, aggression, and the aesthetic of power. It was the only arena in medieval life where the violence that underpinned feudal society was not only sanctioned but stylized, turned into a spectator sport that rivaled the mass in its ritual complexity. When the herald's proclamation arrived, sealed in wax and delivered with a flourish, it was not merely an invitation. It was a summons to the aristocracy to perform their own identity. The tournament was the pressure valve of a warrior caste that found itself with too much time and too much testosterone between wars. It was a battlefield with a dress code, a place where the chaotic brutality of actual combat was tamed by rules, refereed by peers, and watched by ladies, transforming the grim business of killing into the glorious business of winning. The preparation for this spectacle reveals the profound materialism of the knightly class. The training was a grueling regimen of physics and endurance. The knight had to become a centaur, his body fused to the horse, his balance absolute. He spent hours striking the quinton, a rotating wooden target that would swing a sandbag around to strike the slow or clumsy rider in the back of the head, a humiliating lesson in momentum. Yet the physical training was secondary to the visual preparation. The tournament was a festival of heraldry, the medieval equivalent of modern corporate branding. A knight did not enter the lists as a man. He entered as a living symbol. His shield, painted with lions, crosses, or geometric chevrons, was his resume and his face. In the chaos of the charge, when visors were lowered and humanity was encased in steel, the coat of arms was the only way to distinguish the hero from the victim. To appear in the lists was to submit oneself to the blazon, the language of signs that told the crowd who your father was, who you served, and how much gold you could waste on silk comparisons for your horse. The event itself opened with the grand procession, a parade that served as the prologue to the violence. It was a moment of supreme hypocrisy and supreme beauty, where knights swore oaths to uphold a chivalric code that they would likely violate the moment the trumpet sounded. They vowed to protect the weak, yet they fought for the entertainment of the strong. They pledged fair play, yet the tournament was rife with the dark arts of cheating, lances reinforced with iron to inflict greater damage, armor tampered with to provide unfair advantages, and bribes slipped to officials to overlook a foul blow. This tension between the high ideals of Camelot and the gritty reality of the tilt-yard is what makes the tournament such a fascinating subject of study. It was a lie that everyone agreed to believe in for the sake of the show. Then came the joust, the centerpiece of the liturgy. The mechanics of the joust are terrifying to contemplate. Two men, encased in 80 pounds of plate armor, riding horses traveling at 30 miles per hour, colliding with the force of a car crash, all focused on the tip of a 12-foot wooden lance. The objective was ostensibly to break the lance against the opponent's shield, a display of accuracy and courage. But the crowd hungered for the unhorsing, the violent ejection of a rider from his saddle. It was a game of inches. A strike to the helmet could be fatal, snapping the neck or driving bone fragments into the brain. Injuries were not accidents. They were statistical probabilities. Broken ribs, shattered limbs, and concussions were the entry fee for glory. Even kings were not immune, as Henry VIII would later discover, to the detriment of his sanity. Yet they rode. They rode for the roar of the crowd, for the favor of the patron, and for the sheer intoxicating adrenaline of surviving the impact. But if the joust was a duel of skill, the melee was a brawl of endurance. This was the team sport of the Middle Ages, a chaotic simulation of open warfare where dozens of knights charged one another in a confined space. It was here that the landless knights, the younger sons with nothing to lose, sought their fortune. The melee was a marketplace of ransom. To capture a wealthy opponent was to secure one's financial future. It was dirty, confused, and brutal. Clubs, maces, and blunt swords rose and fell in a cloud of dust, and the chivalry often evaporated in the heat of the scrum. Men were trampled, limbs were crushed, and the line between sport and murder became perilously thin. It was a reminder that beneath the silk and the poetry, the knight was, at his core, a specialist in violence. Hovering over this arena of masculine aggression was the presence of the feminine, codified in the rituals of courtly love. The ladies in the stands were not passive observers. They were the judges of the social hierarchy. A knight would ride with a lady's scarf tied to his arm or her veil fluttering from his lance, publicly declaring his servitude to her beauty. This was a complex social game, a sublimation of sexual desire into martial performance. The tournament allowed for a controlled flirtation, where affairs could be initiated through the language of violence. A victory was an offering to the beloved. A defeat was a tragedy to be mourned by her. The Queen of Love and Beauty presided over the awards, reinforcing the idea that the warrior fought not for himself, but for the inspiration of the feminine ideal. It was a powerful cultural fiction that softened the edges of a brutal society, suggesting that love could tame the beast, even as the beast was busy bashing in his neighbor's helmet. As the Middle Ages waned, the tournament underwent a transformation, evolving from a military training ground into a theatrical pageant. The armor became thicker, specialized for the joust, and useless for war. The lances became hollow, designed to shatter dramatically rather than pierce. The event became a padam, a scripted scenario where knights played characters in an Arthurian fantasy. The arrival of gunpowder and the arquebus on the real battlefield rendered the mounted knight obsolete. A bullet did not care about a coat of arms or a lady's favor. The tournament became a nostalgic exercise, a way for the nobility to pretend that the world had not changed, that individual valor still mattered in the age of the cannon. It persisted as a ghost of itself, eventually morphing into the carousel and the reenactment, a memory of an age when war was beautiful, provided you were watching from the stands. Thus, we leave the medieval world not in the silence of the monastery, but in the echoing crash of the tilt yard, where humanity dressed its violence in gold and called it honor. We have walked a long road together, you and I. We have descended into the suffocating dark of the cesspit with the Gong farmer and climbed the dizzying scaffolding of the cathedral with the treadmill operator. We have stood in the silence of the plague pit and amidst the thunder of the joust. We have watched King Charles the Bald weigh his honor against silver, and we have seen the humble pilgrim weigh his soul against the miles. Now, as the dust settles on this vast tapestry of human endeavor, we must ask the historian's ultimate question. What does it all mean? What is the sum of this suffering, this labor, and this fleeting glory? To look upon the Middle Ages is to look into a mirror that is cracked but startlingly clear. It is easy for the modern mind, insulated by technology and medicine, to view this era as a distant nightmare, a time of nasty, brutish, and short lives, defined solely by filth and ignorance. But this is a shallow reading. When we strip away the surface differences, the tunics, the armor, the lack of electricity, we find a world that is intimately, painfully familiar. It was a world obsessed with status, just as ours is. The knight preening in his gilded armor at the tournament, desperate for the validation of the crowd, is the ancestor of the modern influencer curating a digital life. The merchant buying a fake relic to secure a shortcut to heaven is the forebearer of the consumer seeking spiritual fulfillment in material purchase. The anxieties are identical, only the technology has changed. The true lesson of these worse jobs and brutal histories is not about the resilience of the body, though that is impressive enough. It is about the stubbornness of the human spirit. Consider the Leech collector or the lime burner. These men and women woke every day to a life of guaranteed pain. Yet they woke, they worked, they built communities, they raised families, and they sought meaning in the face of a universe that often seemed hostile, where nature was a predator and the plague was a random judgment. They did not surrender to nihilism. Instead, they constructed vast edifices of meaning. They built the church to explain their suffering. They built the feudal system to organize their chaos. They built the code of chivalry to civilize their violence. There is a profound theological poignancy in the contrast between the mud and the spire. The same civilization that forced men to stomp wool and urine also dreamed of the Gothic arch, a structure of pure light and geometry designed to lift the eyes toward God. The same society that produced the whipping boy also produced the concept of the pilgrimage, a journey of radical equality where the king and the peasant walked the same road. This dualism is the heartbeat of the medieval experience, the inescapable burden of the flesh and the relentless aspiration of the soul. We are creatures of the earth, bound to the soil and the biological realities of survival. Yet we are forever trying to build a ladder to the stars, whether through the stone of a cathedral or the glory of a tournament. The legacy of this era is not found in the museums or the ruins. It is woven into the fabric of our daily lives. The university system, the banking structures born of Templar wealth and Italian merchants, the very languages we speak and the borders we defend. These are the inheritances of the medieval struggle. But more than that, we inherit their questions. We are still asking how to live a good life in a world filled with suffering. We are still asking how to find justice in a hierarchy of power. We are still asking what we are willing to sacrifice, our time, our bodies, our silver, for the sake of security and salvation. As we close this chapter, let us not look back with pity on the Gong farmer or the rat catcher. Let us look back with recognition. They are us, stripped of our modern comforts, enduring the human condition in its rawest form. They remind us that civilization is fragile, built on the backs of the invisible, maintained by the sweat of the forgotten, and redeemed occasionally by the enduring hope that there is something more than just the struggle. The lantern is dimmed, the manuscript is closed, the history is written.